The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $60, and Delbert Prine laughed so loud, a barn swallow shot out of the rafters of the old Grange Hall and cut a hard line for the open door. It was the 12th of April, 1986, at the Ackerley Estate auction outside of Millbrook Falls, in the low country of eastern Ohio, where the fields were still black with last year's stubble and the wind still carried a January bite. The sky was the color of dishwater, the folding chairs were mismatched, and the object that had just been sold was a riveted iron dispatch box, about the size of a small tackle chest, painted a dull black that had gone chalky at the corners, with a brass keyhole plate long since gone green, and a lid held down by a row of round-headed rivets that looked like the knuckles of an old fist. There was no key. There was no handle worth trusting. There were two carrying rings on the sides, one bent, one snapped. The lock had been drilled at some point long ago by someone who had given up before finishing, so the faceplate was scarred, but the bolt inside had never turned. The box weighed, by the look of the man who carried it to the buyer's table, somewhere close to 40 pounds. It had come out of a back closet in a farmhouse pantry, along with 2 crates of canning jars and a wringer washer that no one bid on. The man who had bought it was Amos Weller, and he was 71 years old that spring. He was lean the way old fence posts are lean, stooped a little in the shoulder, with a face so deeply lined it looked cut rather than grown. He wore a canvas jacket the color of a wet field, a chambray shirt buttoned to the neck, and a work cap gone pale at the brim from 20 years of sun. His hands were the kind of hands that told a whole life without a word being spoken. The knuckles were swollen. The nails were short and clean. There was a shine along the pads of his fingers where the calluses had been worn smooth, and a small pucker of scar tissue along the back of his right thumb from a slipped chisel 40 years past. Amos Weller was a locksmith by trade, and had been since 1937, and before that he had been the boy who swept the shop of a man named Halvor Enger, who had taught him what a lock was and what a lock was not. Delbert Prine, on the other hand, was 52, heavy-set through the middle, ruddy in the cheeks from either the wind or his own opinions, and dressed in a green sport coat with a small gold pin on the lapel shaped like a house. He sold real estate out of a storefront on Main, and he drove a maroon Oldsmobile that he washed on Sunday mornings so the whole town could see him doing it. He wore a class ring and a wristwatch that caught the light, and he had a laugh that traveled farther than his handshake. $60 for a boat anchor, Delbert said, loud enough to reach every folding chair in the hall. Weller, you finally bought yourself a paperweight. Congratulations. You gonna put flowers on it? A few people chuckled the way people chuckle when they don't want to be on the wrong side of the loudest man in the room. Amos Weller did not answer. He walked to the buyer's table, counted out 3 20s from a worn billfold, and signed the clerk's sheet in the small, straight hand of a man who had been taught to write before ballpoints were common. He had noticed something on the box that no one else had bothered to notice. There was a maker's stamp on the underside of the front edge, pressed into the iron where the paint had chipped away, and it read, Fenneman and Sons, Cleveland, and beneath it a 4-digit lot number and the year 1919. And more than that, he had noticed the rivets. They were not factory rivets. Someone had added a second row along the lid seam, hand-set, hammered flat, the heads not quite uniform. Somebody had sealed the box a second time, after it left Fenneman and Sons, and that somebody had wanted very badly for it to stay shut. Now Amos Weller had learned his trade from Halvor Enger in a shop on Cushing Street the winter he turned 15. Halvor was a Norwegian with hands like split cordwood and a habit of speaking in slow sentences that had the shape of proverbs. He had told the boy Amos, on the first morning, that a lock was not a puzzle and not a wall, but a conversation. He had said, "A lock will tell you everything about itself if you are quiet enough to hear it, and everything about the man who said it, if you are patient enough to ask." He had said, "We do not force a lock, boy. We listen until it agrees," and Amos Weller had believed him, at 15, and he believed him still at 71, In the year 1986, sitting in his old Ford stepside with a riveted dispatch box on the passenger seat beside him and the wind pushing at the door. If you have ever watched a quiet, capable person work at something the world has decided is not worth doing, and felt some small, stubborn thing in yourself take heart from it, then you already understand what this channel is about, and you might take a second to subscribe, because these are the stories we tell here, and I would rather tell them to you than to no one at all. Amos Weller drove home slowly. He did not turn the radio on. He rested one hand on the top of the box, the way a man might rest a hand on a dog he did not yet know. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness, right up until the moment it doesn't. Amos Weller had lived by that patience for over half a century, and had never once needed to say it out loud. He carried the box into his shop that afternoon, the small clapboard building behind his house on Ellis Road that had been his workshop since 1948. There was a bench along one wall, a vise bolted to it, a pegboard of picks and tension wrenches and cut blanks, a small forge he no longer used, but had never had the heart to sell, and a stool with a leather seat worn to the shape of him. He set the box on the bench under the yellow light of a hooded lamp, and he sat down on the stool, and for a long time he did not touch it. He looked at it. He looked at the rivets. He counted them. There were 31. He counted them twice. By the following morning, the news had traveled, the way news travels in a town of 1,100 people. At the Sunrise Diner on Front Street, Delbert Prine held court in the corner booth and told the story of the boat anchor to anyone who would take a coffee refill, and even to some who wouldn't. He called it Weller's Folly. He called it the tin coffin. He said Amos had finally lost the last of his marbles, and the marbles had rolled under a locked box that would never open. And people laughed, because Delbert was loud, and it was easier to laugh than to argue. Old Ren Chudley, who had known Amos since the two of them were boys pulling carp out of the Little Muskingum, came out to the shop that Wednesday with a thermos of coffee and a doubtful look on his face. Ren was 80 that year, and had earned the right to be doubtful about most things. He sat on the extra stool and watched Amos work a slow file along the edge of one of the drilled-out screw heads on the lock face. "Delbert's telling the whole county you got taken," Ren said. Amos did not look up. He said, "It'll open." Ren waited. Amos filed. After a while, Ren poured coffee for them both and said, "You always were the stubbornest man I know." Amos said, "That's the nicest thing you've said to me since 1962. And Ren laughed, and the laugh was not the same kind of laugh as Delbert's. Now the box itself had a history, though the town did not know it, and even Amos did not yet know all of it. The farmhouse it had come out of had belonged to a woman named Ada Ackerley, who had died at 91 the previous November, alone in her bedroom, with her Bible open on her lap and the radio on low. Ada had lived in that house since she was a bride in 1919, the same year the box had been made. And Ada had been married, briefly, to a man named Silas Ackerley, who had worked as a paymaster for the Kesterson Coal Company out of Wheeling, and who had died in the summer of 1923 under a cloud so heavy that Ada had worn it for the rest of her life. The story, as the county remembered it, was that Silas Ackerley had disappeared one Friday in July of 1923 with a payroll of $7,200 in company scrip and cash, and had been found 3 days later in a ravine off the Barcamp Road, dead of what the coroner called a fall, though there were those who said the fall had been helped along. The money had never been recovered. The Kesterson Coal Company had put a lien on the Ackerley farm that Ada spent 31 years paying off out of egg money and mending work, and the name Silas Ackerley had been spoken in that county for 63 years, the way you speak the name of a thief. Ada had never remarried. Ada had never spoken his name in public after the funeral. Ada had kept a riveted iron dispatch box in the back of her pantry closet, behind a curtain of oilcloth, for 63 years, and had told no one what was in it, and had died without a will worth the paper it was written on, so everything she owned had gone to auction to settle the last of her debts. If you have made it this far into the story, I would ask you to hit the subscribe button, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you, and I would like to tell it to someone who wants to hear it. Amos Weller did not know Ada Ackerley's story in April of 1986. He knew only that the box was old, that the second row of rivets had been set by hand, and that the lock had been drilled by someone who did not know what they were doing and had given up. He knew the box wanted to be opened. He knew it also wanted to be opened right. He worked on it for 11 nights. He did not hurry. He did not drill. He did not take a torch to it, though he had one hanging on the wall not 4 feet from the bench. He mixed a paste of penetrating oil and graphite and worked it into the rivet seams with a horsehair brush, and he let it sit, and he came back the next night and worked it in again. He made a small jig out of a scrap of oak and 2 carriage bolts to hold the box steady on its side. He tapped each rivet head with a jeweler's hammer, listening, and marked the ones that answered dull and the ones that answered bright, because a rivet that has rusted through inside its own shank will not sing the same as one that is still sound. He mapped the box the way a man might map the ice on a pond he intended to cross. On the 4th night, his grandnephew Colby came out to the shop, a boy of 19 who was quiet in a way that made most people underestimate him, and who had been coming out to the shop on and off for 2 years to learn what Amos was willing to teach. Colby sat on the extra stool and watched, and did not ask questions, and after an hour Amos handed him the jeweler's hammer and said, "Tap that one. Tell me what you hear." Colby tapped. He said, "Dull." Amos said, "Good. Mark it." And they worked together like that for 2 hours, and neither of them spoke more than was needed. And when Colby left that night, he took a small piece of the shop's quiet with him, which was the best thing Amos knew how to give. By the 9th night, Amos had removed the drilled-out lock face entirely, and had found beneath it a second lock, a small brass wafer mechanism set flush into the iron, of a kind that Fenneman and Sons had used for banking pouches around the turn of the century. He had a set of blanks in a drawer that had belonged to Halvor Enger, and one of them, with a little filing, took the shape of a key that fit. On the 11th night, at just past 10 o'clock in the evening, with the wind moving in the pines behind the shop and the yellow lamp throwing his shadow long across the bench, Amos Weller turned the key he had made, and the wafer lock let go with a sound like a held breath, finally letting go. He did not open the lid. Not yet. He set the key down on the bench, and he wiped his hands on a rag, and he sat for a while looking at the box in the way a man might sit with a coffin before a burial. Then he took a small pry bar with a padded edge and worked the handset rivets loose one by one, and this took him another hour, because he did not want to gouge the iron. And when the last rivet came free, he set his palms flat on the lid and pushed it open, slowly, so the hinges, which had not moved in 63 years, would not snap. Inside the box, wrapped in a piece of oiled canvas that had turned brown at the folds, were 3 things. There was a leather ledger, cracked along the spine, with the words Kesterson Coal Company Payroll, July 1923, stamped in gold on the cover. There was a canvas bank bag, sagging heavy, tied with a length of butcher twine, and there was a folded letter, sealed with a spot of red wax that had gone dark as dried blood, with a single word written on the outside in a careful, upright hand. The word was Ada. Amos did not open the letter first. He opened the ledger. Inside, in the same upright hand, was a full accounting of the July 1923 payroll, every miner's name, every dollar owed, every dollar paid, and at the bottom, in a different ink, a note that read, "The above is true and correct. What follows is not." And on the next page was a second accounting, and this one showed where the missing $7,200 had actually gone. It had gone into the pocket of a man named Wilbur Kesterson, the mine owner's brother, who had been skimming the payroll for 11 months and blaming the shortfall on the paymaster. There were dates. There were bank deposit slips folded between the pages. There were 2 letters from Wilbur to a woman in Pittsburgh, signed in his own hand, referring to the arrangement in language that could not be mistaken. Amos closed the ledger. He untied the bank bag. Inside was $6,840 in old bills and a small drawstring pouch of gold coins, 12 of them, double eagles, dated between 1899 and 1907. He did not count the coins twice. He counted them once and put them back. Then he opened the letter. It was dated July the 17th, 1923, and it was written to Ada. It said, "My dear wife, if you are reading this, then I did not come home, and I want you to know, first, that I loved you, and second, that I was not a thief. I found what Wilbur has been doing. I told his brother yesterday, and his brother told me to go home and forget it. I do not think I will be allowed to forget it. I am hiding this box tonight, in the place you and I both know. If they say I ran, do not believe them. If they say I stole, do not believe them. The proof is here. The money is here. Every dollar of it that I could get back. Take it to the sheriff when it is safe. If it is never safe, keep it hidden, and know at least in your own heart that your husband was an honest man. Yours always, Silas." Amos Weller sat on the stool in his shop for a long time and did not move. He was 71 years old, and he had seen a great many things in his life, but he had not often seen a thing like this, a thing that had been waiting 63 years in the dark for the right pair of hands to find it, and he sat with it, and he let it settle in him the way a heavy thing settles in a boat, and he did not weep, but his eyes were wet, and he took his cap off and set it on the bench beside the letter. He could have kept it. He was an old man living on a shrinking pension in a small house on Ellis Road, and he had, in front of him, nearly $7,000 in old money and 12 gold coins that would fetch 3 times their face at any dealer in Columbus. He could have burned the letter and the ledger, kept the money, and no one on this earth would ever have known. Ada Ackerley was dead. Silas Ackerley had been dead for 63 years. Wilbur Kesterson had been dead since 1948. The Kesterson Coal Company had folded in 1961. There was no one left to be hurt by silence, and no one left to know. Amos Weller did not consider it for more than the length of a breath. He folded the letter back along its old creases. He tied the bank bag closed with the same twine. He wrapped the ledger in a fresh piece of oilcloth. He put all 3 back inside the box, and he closed the lid, and he sat with his hand on it until the yellow lamp got hot enough that he had to switch it off. The next morning was a Saturday. Amos Weller drove into town in his old Ford, with the box on the seat beside him. He did not go to Delbert Prine's office, though he passed it. He did not go to the diner. He went to a small brick house on Sycamore Street, where a woman named Marcella Ackerley Boyd lived, and had lived for 31 years, working as a bookkeeper for the feed mill and raising 2 children on her own. Marcella was Silas and Ada's granddaughter, by way of a daughter Ada had born in 1922, a fact half the county had forgotten, and the other half had never known. Marcella was 64 years old and tired, in the way women who have worked their whole lives are tired, dignified in the way such women are dignified, and she opened the door to Amos Weller in her housecoat, and looked at the iron box in his arms, and did not, at first, understand. Amos said only, "This belonged to your grandfather. He wanted it to reach your grandmother. It didn't. I think it's meant for you now." He set the box on her kitchen table, and he showed her the letter, and he showed her the ledger, and he showed her the bank bag. And when Marcella began to cry, quietly, with her hand pressed flat over her mouth, Amos Weller put his cap back on and let himself out the front door, and drove home before she could gather herself enough to thank him. The rest of it moved the way such things move once they are set in motion. Marcella took the ledger and the letter to the county prosecutor on Monday morning. The prosecutor took them to a historian at the State Archives in Columbus by Wednesday. By the end of May, the Wheeling paper ran a front-page piece under the headline, "Paymaster Cleared After 63 Years," with a photograph of Silas Ackerley in a stiff collar from 1921, and a smaller photograph of Marcella standing on her porch, with her hand resting on the top of the iron box. The Kesterson family, what was left of them, said nothing. The county sheriff issued a formal statement withdrawing the 1923 finding. The lien that had eaten Ada's egg money for 31 years was, retroactively, declared unjust, and a small settlement was paid to Marcella from a trust that had been holding old Kesterson assets since the company folded. Delbert Prine, when the paper came out, said very little. He was seen at the diner that week, but he did not hold court in the corner booth. He sold his real estate storefront within 18 months. He moved to Florida in the fall of 1988, and the maroon Oldsmobile went with him, and the town did not miss either of them the way he might have hoped. The iron dispatch box was placed on display that autumn in a glass case in the lobby of the Millbrook Falls Town Library, with a small brass plaque beneath it that read, "This box was hidden in July of 1923 by Silas Ackerley, paymaster, to preserve the truth of his innocence. It was opened in April of 1986 by Amos Weller, locksmith. Both men are remembered here for their patience. There was no ceremony when they set it in the case. Marcella asked for none, and Amos would not have come if there had been. He went to see it once, on a Tuesday evening in October, after the library had closed and the janitor let him in through the side door as a favor. He stood in front of the glass case for a while with his cap in his hand. He did not touch the glass. He looked at the rivets he had loosened, at the drilled-out lock face he had removed and set back in place for the display, at the small brass wafer lock beneath it that had waited 63 years for the right key. Then he put his cap back on and walked out to his truck and drove home to Ellis Road, and he made himself a supper of eggs and toast, and he went out to the shop after and sat on his stool with the yellow lamp on, and he did not work on anything in particular. He just sat there with his hands on the bench, and the shop was quiet, and that was enough. He kept working, of course. He took Colby on as a proper apprentice that winter, and taught him what Halvor Enger had taught him, that a lock is a conversation, and that we do not force a lock, and that patience is not the same as waiting. He lived another 9 years. He never spoke publicly about the box. When people asked, and they did ask, for a while, he would say only that it had been an interesting piece of work, and change the subject to the weather, which in eastern Ohio is always a subject worth changing to. So I will leave it with you tonight. If you had been Amos Weller, sitting on that stool in that shop on the 11th night, with the lid finally open and the letter in your hand and no one on this earth left to know what you did next, would you have folded the letter back along its old creases and driven it to a woman on Sycamore Street the next morning? Or would you have closed the box and kept the money and let a dead man stay a thief?